It's that time again. Time to enter the mysterious world of the occult. And tonight's story concerns the strange happenings which centered around an old painting. But first, as usual, let me set the scene. The painting in question is not an old master, nor is it particularly valuable, but the workmanship in it is superb. It depicts a Victorian room in the middle of which is standing a distinguished gentleman. To the side of him is a large mirror which covers most of the wall it's fixed to, and in the mirror is the reflection of the gentleman. In the reflection of the reflection, if you see what I mean, is the other part of the room which cannot be seen in the main painting. And we can see that on the opposite wall is another big mirror. And reflected in this mirror is the gentleman again. And so it goes on into infinity. The detail is superb. And as I've said, although the picture isn't valuable, it's a magnificent example of the artist's craft. Anyway, to tonight's story. Some 7 or 8 years ago, a man saw the picture displayed in the window of an art gallery. But at the time, it was too expensive for him, so he contented himself with just admiring it. After a short while, it disappeared from the window, and the man assumed that it had been sold. But about 2 months later, it once again was on display. This time, the price was lower than before, but it was still too expensive. And as before, it was removed from the window after a few weeks, probably sold again. By now, the man was both intrigued and had also developed an unnatural desire to own the painting. So he wasn't too surprised when, after another 2 months or so, it once again appeared in the gallery window. This time, the price was significantly lower, and the man decided to go in and see if he couldn't haggle a bit. To his astonishment, the gallery owner, when he was asked if the price for the picture was negotiable, said simply that he would take any reasonable offer for it. The man, more as a trial than anything else, offered half the asking price, and the offer was immediately accepted without any further ado. So the man immediately paid the price and arranged for the picture to be delivered to his house. At last, the picture was his. Later that day, the picture was delivered, and the man hung it on the main wall of his lounge. For the next hour or so, he just sat in his favorite chair and admired the workmanship. For the first time, he noticed that the colors were superb. In fact, everything about the picture was magnificent. If he narrowed his eyes, the picture looked so real, he might have been standing in the room with the Victorian gentleman. Fortunately, the man's wife also liked the picture, so happiness was complete. Or was it? That night, the man went to bed with a warm feeling of satisfaction. He soon fell asleep, but at about 2:30 the next morning, he woke up with a start. He lay in bed wondering what had woken him so suddenly, and as he heard nothing, he closed his eyes again. But as he did so, he heard a noise coming from downstairs. It sounded like someone moving around. It was obvious he had burglars, so he quietly put on his dressing gown and crept out of the room. As he descended the stairs, the sounds became louder. They were coming from the lounge and sounded for all the world like two people arguing quietly. Mystified and a little nervous, the man reached the bottom of the stairs and took a stout walking stick from the hall stand. Then he tiptoed quickly to the lounge door. The sounds were definitely coming from this room, so, steeling himself, he took hold of the handle and flung the door open. But what he saw made him doubt the evidence of his own eyes. For he found himself looking into a completely strange room. It was not his lounge. It was more like a Victorian room. The furniture was turn of the century, and the room was illuminated by the light from several gas mantles around the walls. But what scared him most of all was the figure standing in the middle of the room. It was a tall, slim man of middle years, dressed in clothes reminiscent of the late 1800s. He was standing upright and looking to his left over his shoulder. He seemed oblivious to the man flinging the door open. He just stared at the wall. Despite himself, The owner of the house followed the stranger's gaze and was startled to see, on the wall, a huge mirror. This was what the man was looking over his shoulder at. His reflection was clear, and behind it, the owner could see the other half of the room behind the door. But still, it wasn't his room. He could see another huge mirror reflected in the glass, and in this mirror was the stranger's reflection. At this moment, it suddenly dawned on him. What he was looking at was his new picture. Of course, that must be it. He'd obviously forgotten he'd just bought it, and he hadn't realized how much it dominated the room. The illumination was probably from a street lamp outside. The man relaxed and was about to close the door when the stranger turned and looked him straight in the eyes. Instantly, terror gripped the man. How was it possible for a picture to move? Against his better judgment, the man found himself walking slowly into the room. He heard the door close gently behind him, and at that moment, he knew that he was experiencing something that wasn't natural. The stranger smiled gently at him, but there was no welcome in his eyes. There remained 2 pinpoints of black, expressionless, almost lifeless. What on earth was happening? How could all this be? As if the stranger was able to read his thoughts, he answered the unspoken questions. I say he answered, but that's not quite correct. The man could hear the voice in his head, but the stranger's lips didn't move. The man heard a deep, resonant voice ask him who he was and what right did he have to violate private property. His immediate response was one of anger. After all, this was his house, not the stranger's. But again, he heard the voice say that he must be mad. It wasn't his house, but that of the stranger. At this point, anger fully overtook the fear that the man was feeling. He raised the walking stick he was carrying and threatened the stranger with the police if he didn't leave the house immediately. At this, the man laughed, a throaty, maniacal laugh, and raised his hand and pointed at the man. The walking stick was wrenched from his grasp and flew across the room. At the same time, the man felt himself being pulled towards the stranger by an unseen force. When he was but a few inches from him, he was turned towards the mirror hanging on the wall. And he then got the shock of his life, because in it, he could see his own reflection standing next to the stranger. This was obviously real. Somehow, he'd been drawn into, well, he didn't know what. Perhaps this was just a vivid dream. But no sooner had this thought formed in his mind when he heard the stranger laugh again and tell him that it was indeed real, and there was no way out. Now, fear can make people do strange things, and this was no exception. The man suddenly struck out at the stranger with his fist, and it connected with his jaw. The stranger reeled backwards and bellowed in rage and pain. But not wanting to prolong a fistfight, the man turned and dashed for the door. He reached it, wrenched it open, and collapsed into the hall. His own hall. For he found that he was back in familiar surroundings. Gasping for breath, he determined to remove the stranger from his house, come what may. So he turned back to enter the lounge, and as he went in, he found that it was back to normal. Gone was the strange furniture, gone were the gas mantles, and gone were the huge mirrors. But most important, there was no sign of the mysterious stranger. Relieved, he looked around the room carefully and satisfied himself that all was back to normal. But just as he was about to leave, he noticed the picture hanging on the wall. He could see that there was something different about it, so he went to it to take a closer look. And what he saw defied belief. The figure of the man in the picture was the stranger who had bewitched him a few minutes ago. But that wasn't what bewildered him. Because as he peered at the picture, he noticed a feature he hadn't seen before. Reflected in the mirror, behind the Victorian gentleman, was another figure. A figure dressed in clothes which were incongruous in the setting. They were 20th century clothes, In fact, it was a man in a dressing gown. And the face of the man was his own face, reflected back and forth in the painted mirrors into infinity. Unable to believe what he was seeing, he dashed upstairs and woke his wife. Without telling her what he wanted, he made her come downstairs and look at the picture, and she also saw the image of her husband. And then he told her what he had just experienced. Their immediate reaction was that there was something odd going on which they didn't understand, but it was connected with the picture. And the man didn't need too much persuasion to take it back the next morning to the gallery he had bought it from. Feeling foolish, but desperate to find out if there was a history to the picture, he quizzed the gallery owner, especially as to why it had been put up for sale 3 times in 6 months. And after much reluctance, the gallery owner admitted that the previous owners had brought it back, saying that even if they lost their money, they didn't want to keep it. But they didn't give a full explanation. Oh, by the way, the reflection the man saw of himself in the picture, when he returned the painting to the gallery he had brought it from, and as he was waiting for the gallery owner to appear, the image faded before his eyes. But he still had a physical memory of that night, because the knuckles on his right hand were bruised as if he'd been in a fist fight. Well, to cut a long story short, eventually I got to hear of the strange stories surrounding this picture, and I set about seeing if I could find out its history. And it wasn't too hard to find out either. The picture was of a man called William Dench, who lived from 1810 to 1886. He was a strange man who was said to have developed his skills in the black arts. Certainly, he had quite a following among the wealthy, bored Victorian wives of the period, and was eventually accused by one irate husband of bewitching his wife and obtaining her money by false pretenses. He was found guilty in a court of law and spent the next 5 years in jail, where he died of pneumonia. But before he died, he swore that he would have his revenge, a revenge more terrible than anyone could imagine. Perhaps the man's experience was part of that revenge. In any event, if you happen to see a magnificent painting in an art gallery depicting an elegant Victorian man looking at himself in a huge mirror, don't be tempted to buy it, will you? No matter what the price. It could be the portrait of William Dench, a man bent on revenge, even from beyond the grave.